Anger doesn't always look like yelling or slamming doors, even though that's what most people picture first. Most of the time it shows up quietly, slipping into your day as irritation, impatience, or a tight tension you can't quite name. You might feel it in how fast you react or how little tolerance you suddenly have for things that never used to bother you. It can feel automatic, like it arrives before you've had time to think. And instead of feeling powerful, it often leaves you feeling worn down. You might catch yourself thinking, why does everything annoy me lately? Not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in this steady, low-level irritation that seems to follow you around. Small inconveniences feel heavier than they should, as if your emotional margin has quietly disappeared. Things pile up faster in your body than they do in your mind, and you don't remember choosing to feel this way. What makes this especially confusing is that you're still functioning through all of it. You're getting through the day, showing up, and handling what needs to be handled. On the outside, things look mostly fine, which makes the anger harder to justify. You tell yourself you shouldn't feel this irritated if you're managing as well as you are. That gap between how things look and how they feel only adds to the frustration. So you start correcting yourself internally before the anger even fully forms. You remind yourself to calm down, to be more patient, to just let things go. You compare your situation to others who seem to have it worse. The feeling gets interrupted before it has a chance to make sense, and instead of dissolving, it settles deeper. When anger doesn't feel allowed, it doesn't disappear, it adapts. It gets quieter for a while, more contained and more controlled. Then it sharpens, waiting for moments when your guard is lower. It leaks out sideways in tone, tension, and reactions you didn't plan. That's usually when you start wondering what's wrong with you. This is often the point where anger gets labeled as the problem itself, something to fix, manage, or eliminate as quickly as possible. You might see it as a sign that you're failing at being calm, grateful, or emotionally mature. The focus turns towards getting rid of the feeling rather than understanding it, and that misunderstanding keeps the cycle going. But anger is rarely the root issue, even when it feels overwhelming. It's more like a signal flare than a character flaw, not announcing that everything is broken, just that something important has been overlooked. It shows up when an internal line has been crossed too many times, and it doesn't stop until it feels acknowledged. Most people were taught, directly or indirectly, to ignore that signal, to push through discomfort and keep going no matter what, to prioritize being easy, capable, or dependable over being honest with themselves. And over time, that training builds pressure under the surface. Anger is often where that pressure finally finds a voice. If you pause here for a moment and really stay with this idea, something shifts. The anger starts to feel less random and less personal. It stops being evidence that you're a failure. Instead, it starts to look like information you haven't been given space to process. That shift alone can feel strangely relieving. The question quietly changes once you see it this way. It's no longer, why am I like this, or what's wrong with me? It becomes, what part of me has been carrying too much burden for too long? That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It just opens the door to understanding what the anger has been guarding. Anger rarely shows up out of nowhere, even when it feels sudden. It usually arrives after something else has been ignored for a very long time. Stress, disappointment, exhaustion, or resentment quietly pile up underneath it. Anger becomes the emotion that finally has enough energy to surface. Not because it's the strongest feeling, but because it's the last one standing. Think about how often you push past what you're feeling just to keep things moving. You tell yourself it's not a big deal, that you'll deal with it later. You minimize moments that bothered you because stopping feels inconvenient or indulgent. But your nervous system doesn't forget what your mind tries to skip. It keeps score even when you don't. Anger often protects feelings that feel too vulnerable to sit with directly. Sadness, grief, fear, or shame don't always feel safe to express. They slow you down, soften you, or ask for care you're not sure you're allowed to need. Anger steps in because it feels more decisive and more controlled. It gives you armor when you don't feel like you can be exposed. Sometimes anger is guarding boundaries you never learned how to set. You say yes when you mean no, or you stay quiet when something crosses a line. Each small compromise feels manageable in the moment, but over time those moments stack up in your body. Anger shows up when your limits have been ignored way too many times. There's also the kind of anger that comes from feeling unseen or unheard. Not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle sense that your experience doesn't fully register. You explain yourself, adjust yourself, or shrink parts of yourself to keep the peace. The frustration doesn't disappear just because the conversation ends. It stays, waiting for acknowledgement that never quite comes. You might notice this anger flares when you're already tired or stretched thin. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a failure of self-control. When your energy is low, you don't have the same buffer anymore. The feelings you've been holding back rise closer to the surface. Anger is often what slips through when there's no filter left to suppress it. This doesn't mean you're secretly an angry person at your core. It means you've been carrying more emotional weight than you've had room to process. Anger becomes the outlet when everything else has been postponed. It's less about aggression and more about accumulated strain. Understanding that changes how you relate to it. Instead of asking how to get rid of the anger, a different question helps. What has been asking for attention long before the anger showed up? What feelings were inconvenient, uncomfortable, or easy to dismiss at the time? Anger often points backwards, not forward. It's drawing your attention to something unresolved. When you see anger as the symptom rather than the problem, it softens it slightly. Not instantly and not perfectly, but enough to notice the difference. You stop fighting it and start listening to what it's been trying to protect. That shift reduces the internal pressure, and pressure is what usually makes anger feel explosive. You don't need to fix everything to begin understanding this pattern. You just need to slow down long enough to notice what keeps getting put off. Anger isn't asking to be unleashed or eliminated. It's asking to be translated into something more honest and precise. That translation is where real relief starts. Over time, anger can stop being a reaction and start feeling like a baseline, not because everything suddenly got worse, but because it became familiar. Your mind learns that anger moves faster than other emotions. It sharpens focus, creates distance, and gives you a sense of control. So it starts showing up first, before anything else gets a chance to. This is especially true if you grew up needing to stay alert or guarded. When you didn't feel safe, your nervous system learned how to stay activated. Anger keeps you ready, even when nothing immediate is happening. It scans for problems before they appear. That constant readiness can feel like irritability or tension you can't quite shake. You might notice your thoughts becoming more rigid when anger is under the surface. Everything feels more black and white, more urgent and more personal. Small frustrations feel loaded, like proof of something bigger happening. Your mind fills in gaps quickly, often assuming the worst. Anger thrives on speed, not nuance. There's also a loop that forms between anger and self-talk. You replay conversations, imagine better comebacks, or criticize yourself for not reacting differently. Those mental rehearsals keep the emotion alive long after the moment passes. Instead of processing what happened, you stay stuck in it. Anger feeds on repetition. Sometimes it becomes a way to avoid feeling powerless. It's easier to feel mad than unsure, disappointed, or small. Anger gives you a sense of agency when you don't know what to do next. Even frustration feels better than helplessness, so the mind reaches for anger as a familiar tool. This doesn't mean you're choosing to be mad consciously. It means your system learned that anger works, at least in the short term. It protects you from vulnerability and keeps you moving forward. But what works temporarily can become exhausting over time. The body pays the cost even when the mind feels justified. You might also notice that the anger rises most when you feel misunderstood, when your intentions don't match how you're being perceived, or when you feel like you have to explain yourself over and over. That friction builds quietly, but anger steps in when patience runs out. The thing is that anger can mask what you actually need. Rest might look like irritation, grief might look like resentment, fear might look like defensiveness. When rage leads the conversation, those needs stay unmet. This is why simply calming down never really works long term. You're not just dealing with an emotion in the moment, you're dealing with a pattern that formed for a reason. Anger isn't random, it's rehearsed. And rehearsed patterns need awareness before they can change. The shift begins when you notice anger arriving earlier than it needs to, when it jumps in before you fully understood what you're reacting to. That pause doesn't erase the anger, it gives you a little space to ask what else might be present, and that space is where choice quietly returns. Anger doesn't always look like yelling or obvious frustration. More often it shows up as tension, sarcasm, or a short fuse you don't recognize as anger first. It can live in the way you respond quickly instead of thoughtfully, or in the way patience feels harder to access than it used to. These small shifts are easy to miss because they feel normal. You might notice yourself getting irritated at things that never used to bother you. Minor delays, small mistakes, or casual comments suddenly feel heavier. It's not that those things have changed, it's that your emotional margin has gotten smaller. Anger fills the space where flexibility used to live. In conversations, it often shows up as defensiveness. You feel the urge to explain, correct, or justify yourself immediately. Even neutral feedback can feel like a personal attack. Your body tightens before your mind catches up. That reaction happens faster than you can reason with it. Sometimes it leaks out as pulling away instead of confrontation. You go quiet, disengage, or emotionally check out. It feels safer to pull back than to risk saying something you can't take back. But the feelings don't disappear just because you stop talking. They settle deeper and grow heavier. You might also notice anger in how you talk to yourself. Your inner voice becomes harsher, less forgiving, and more critical. Mistakes feel like proof instead of information. You replay moments where you think you should have handled things differently, but that internal pressure keeps that anger circulating. Anger can even affect how you make decisions. You choose avoidance, distraction, or working too much instead of rest. You stay busy to outrun the feeling. But constant movement doesn't resolve what's underneath. It just delays the moment it catches up. In relationships, anger often hides behind distance or impatience. You feel less curious and more reactive. Listening becomes harder when you're already bracing for conflict. Even people you care about can start to feel draining. That's not a character flaw, it's a sign of overload. But none of these moments feel dramatic on their own. They blend into daily life and become part of your normal rhythm. You adapt to the tension without realizing it's there. Anger doesn't demand attention all at once. It slowly reshapes how you move through the world. The goal here isn't to judge these reactions or force them away. Noticing them is already a form of change. Awareness softens the edge before action ever does. You start seeing patterns instead of isolated moments, and patterns are easier to work with than emotions that feel random. When you recognize how anger shows up, you gain a small but important pause, a moment where you can choose curiosity over reaction. That choice won't always feel easy or natural, but even brief pauses interrupt the cycle. An interruption is how new habits begin. Now that you've noticed how anger moves through you, the next step isn't fixing it all at once. You don't need to erase the feeling or explain every moment perfectly. You just need to slow down long enough to watch it, without judgment. Pay attention to where it surfaces and what it seems to be guarding. That simple acknowledgement is already a form of choice. Ask yourself where you normally ignore your own needs. Not with big dramatic gestures, but in small everyday moments. Saying yes when you want to say no, or staying silent when your voice matters. These tiny compromises add up over time and quietly feed the background anger. Naming them gently changes how they affect you. You might start with just one small boundary today, a pause before committing to something, a moment to check in with how you actually feel. Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind your nervous system that your choice matters. Even subtle acts of agency begin to shift the tension in your body. Anger doesn't need to disappear to be useful. It becomes a guide when you treat it as information rather than a problem. Instead of reacting automatically, you can ask what it's trying to protect. You don't need to answer immediately. You only need to acknowledge it and give it space to exist. You may notice relief comes slowly at first. Even tiny acts of self-recognition feel significant because they've been postponed for so long. Anger softens when it knows you're paying attention, even in small doses. You start to see patterns that were invisible before, and with that awareness, the feeling becomes easier to ride instead of resisting. You don't have to resolve everything in one moment, or even in one day. Emotional patterns like this take time to shift. The practice is simply noticing, pausing, and reclaiming small choices. Over time, those choices add up. Anger gradually becomes less of a background hum and more of a useful signal. You might also notice compassion for yourself growing naturally. You stop blaming yourself for feeling a way that is actually understandable. Your nervous system relaxes when it no longer has to defend against judgment. That release is subtle but meaningful, and it makes space for other feelings you might have been ignoring. This approach isn't about eliminating anger or forcing change. It's about creating conditions where you feel safe to respond differently. When you notice a signal, you're already halfway toward a healthier pattern. You allow yourself small moments of choice instead of endless reaction, and that allowance is surprisingly powerful. By the end of the day, you may see that anger is no longer a constant weight. It may still appear, but its intensity is softer. It becomes a teacher, not a dictator. It points out where your attention is needed without overwhelming you. And in that shift, you start to feel more present, more capable, and more understood by yourself. Today, notice one moment where you normally override yourself and don't. That small act of choice is often where anger finally begins to rest. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, please leave a like and subscribe and leave your thoughts and comments down below. I'll see you in the next one.